Good evening. My name is Andrew Copson. I'm the Chief Executive at the British Humanist Association, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this special BHA event this evening and introduce our fine speaker. The hashtag for the event is BHA Goldstein, that is BHA Goldstein. I've noticed from the fact that no one's writing that down, or it's not going to. This is going to be a quiet evening on Twitter. Okay, but if you're inclined to hashtag, there it is. You probably know this evening's speaker as an exceptionally talented novelist. Two of my favourites, The Mind-Body Problem and 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a work of fiction. The full title of which, it is extremely important and earnestly requested, be quoted at all times if you're referring to this book, so I'm glad I got it right. They're just two of my favourite works of hers. I'm sure you have your own. She's also an excellent and inspiring speaker, and in fact, the first time I ever heard her speak, I was on my honeymoon in Boston, and Rebecca was receiving the American Humanist Association Humanist of the Year prize, and she gave a speech about Spinoza that was the highlight of my honeymoon. Absolutely the best moment of the time. Sparkling prose is also much on display in her non-fiction work, and it's one of those books that she'll be speaking to us about this evening. Plato at the Googleplex, Why Philosophy Won't Go Away. It is a brilliant book. It was a great pleasure to read in preparation for this evening. It's on sale outside for you on your way out when you'll be enthusiastic to buy it. And for those of us to whom Plato is a great hate figure, as he certainly is to me, you wouldn't recognize the much improved character of Plato in the book. Listening to her talk about it will be just as enjoyable as reading those words was for me, I'm sure. Please welcome Rebecca Goldstein.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Am I being heard? So I can't tell you how wonderful it is to be here in this room with you, because I've been away from home for what seems a very long time, and I'm very, very homesick. And over the weekend, I was at the Battle of Ideas, and the last event was a discussion, and the topic was why philosophy matters now more than ever before. And one of the reasons that I gave for why philosophy matters now more than ever before was because of the decline of theism and the kind of normative vacuum that has been left because of that. And, people asking, as I heard people asking at the various events, how can we anchor morality if there is no God? And I woke up this morning to a bunch of emails saying, that I was wrong, that theism is in decline. I mean, I thought I was back in the good old States. And, and read Anthony Flou's last book. And I just felt even more homesick. And so this to me is like coming home, really, to be with secular humanists. This is a kind of home away from home that I feel like, for the most part, we get each other, we understand each other. So, although you may not feel the same way that I do about philosophy and its importance at this moment. So why Plato? Plato's not one of the guys that I love particularly. Spinoza is easy to love. Bertrand Russell had said in the History of Western Philosophy that he is the most lovable the noblest and the most lovable philosopher in the Western canon. And that's really quite startling, because Bertrand Russell sort of comes out of character there, and it's more emotional language than he uses through most of that great tome. And he is an easy philosopher to love. Plato, not so much. But Plato and I go back a long time. So some of you may know that I was born into an ultra-Orthodox Jewish family. I come from a very Orthodox Jewish home. And at an early age, things began to not make too much sense to me. And particularly, the notion that, of this good God who is looking out for all of us, particularly his chosen people. In 1956, when the borders of Hungary were a bit porous during the aborted revolution there, my Hungarian family escaped, came out, and the ones who had survived the Holocaust, and a few of them had, and they came to our house and they stayed with us until I was a very young child at that point. They stayed with us until they could get on their feet, and I would hear this whispering about what they had been through, and I kept asking, what's a concentration camp? And my grandmother would say, you should never know. And I couldn't get any straight answers, but I knew that something quite terrible had happened to these very, very broken people. They looked unlike anybody that I saw in my prosperous town. And it was, and I somehow understood that they had been hidden. As a matter of fact, that became my criterion for a friend, which still holds now. The thought always, it started then and it continues now. I always ask of a person, would they hide me? And that's my character standard, which my husband now uses. He comes home, he's met somebody. I said, good guy? Yeah, he would hide us, right? So it's a very formative notion in my head. But it just didn't. Already, I knew this was a grossly unjust universe that we lived in. Nothing was making sense, and I knew, that there could be very bad ideas. That people could have very bad ideas, and they would act on these very bad ideas. It could take hold of a whole society, and that is terrible. I saw some of the victims of that. So I began to think a lot about how do you judge ideas? I was being brought up, and it became very clear to me that I was being brought up in such a way so that I would only be exposed to a certain set of ideas. It was very, very, that's what fundamentalism is, and that's what I was being brought up as. And that, and I remember thinking, how do I know that the ideas that I'm being brought up on are not bad? And I was very suspicious of them because of the fact that I was being not exposed, not allowed to be exposed to any other ideas. That made me extremely suspicious because I thought, well, if they're strong ideas, they should be able to hold up. And so I was really concerned about this, and I asked a few questions, which made my parents put me in an even stricter school, right? A horrible school, an all-girls school where we weren't even supposed to go to college. It was terrible, and I hated it. But I had gotten the idea that I had to learn about ideas, and that somehow, and how to evaluate ideas, and that somehow philosophy was the field that was going to help me do this. That was a field that was devoted to the evaluation of ideas, that it would instruct me on how to think about ideas. So I went to our public library, and I got out a book that makes people laugh, but it was The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant. It was a very popular book, and it was meant for a popular audience. In fact, he was a an anarchist, and he had political and ethical views of which Plato would have thoroughly disapproved. But anyway, he wrote this book, and I got it out of the library. And I wouldn't say that I snuck it home. I wasn't a sneaky child, but I took judicious precautions to get it into the house and up to my bedroom and under the covers where I read it. And the first chapter that I read was on Plato. I understood very little of it. I was very young, I was 13, and very ill-educated, very ignorant child. But I got so excited by what I was reading, the little that got through to me, that, at a certain point I had to put the book down and just, so that my heart would stop racing so much, just I felt like I had, run a marathon or something. The thing that had gotten through to me, I remember very little. I remember he uses, Will Durant, the word sensorium, and I ran to my little pocket dictionary to look up what and phantasmagoria, that one, phantasmagoria. I think it's the first and last time I ever saw that word in print. I ran to my little pocket dictionary to look up phantasmagoria, and it wasn't in it. I thought, wow, this is a really smart book, right? It's really, someday I'm going to be able to understand this stuff. Anyway, what was it that got me so excited? It was this vision of an objective reality that was out there, the same for all of us, that was accessible through the exercise of reason, the same for all of us. That it was, that math had something to do fundamentally with reaching that reality, and that was very exciting to me because the only subject I liked was math. And that it would make us better to assimilate that reality. And I got also the idea, I think this was one of the things that most excited me, was that, to the extent that all of us exercise this faculty of reason, the same for all of us, and reached this reality, we would be inhabiting the same reality, and we would understand each other. We would be in sympathy with each other, which was, I suppose, the thought that most distressed me, that the notion that there are ideologies that so separate us and make us do such dreadful things to one another. So this, I think, I didn't have the vocabulary for formulating, for articulating these ideas, but since this is still an idea that excites me very much, that still makes my heart race, I think that this was what must have gotten through to me. And then I tried to go on, I tried to read Spinoza, forget it. I mean, the chapter on Spinoza, completely impenetrable. But it was enough, to make me feel that there was something in this vision, the notion of objective reality, reason accessed. I certainly didn't think I would go on in philosophy. It was a hard enough chore to get myself to college, and when I did, it seemed the best thing to study was physics, so that's what I studied. But eventually, I did make my way back to philosophy, and actually, there's a story there too. I was taking quantum mechanics. Actually, one of my novels is called Properties of Light, a novel of love, betrayal, and quantum physics. Huge bestseller, as you can imagine. I was taking this course in quantum mechanics, and again, it wasn't making all that much sense to me. And I kept going to my professor and asking him questions, and he was of that school, which was basically his answer to the question of, can I ask, what is this saying about reality? Always interesting, getting to reality, right? What's that objective reality? Physics seemed the way to do it, right? That's why I wanted to study it. But I said, what is this weird theory saying about reality? And his answer was basically, shut up and calculate. And which it just wasn't satisfying me. And then I kept going back to him. And then finally he said, why don't you go talk to the philosophers? They ask this kind of meaningless question. And I did. And whom did I go to? I asked around. I was at Columbia. I asked around. People said, go speak to Sidney Morgenbesser. Sidney Morgenbesser was a legend in his day. In fact, there's a biography that hopefully is coming soon. And Sidney was known for his conversation, just as Socrates was. In fact, he had the same publishing record as Socrates. Right, the empty set. And, but he was an amazing, amazing conversationalist, living dialogue. And he did indeed, answer my questions and pounded with me with a lot more questions that I had never thought of. And we spoke that first day for 6 hours. And we went out for a beer, came back, spoke some more. And he told me, I think you were interested in philosophy. I think you're interested in philosophy of science. And so that's how I did find my way back to philosophy. Plato. Why Plato? Plato's been in the back of my head for a long time as a kind of annoyance, really. For one thing, he banished the poets from his utopia. Who were the novelists of his day. There weren't any novelists in ancient Athens, but they were epic poets, and he would have truly hated us contemporary novelists. And this bothers me. It's always bothered me. And always when I'm writing a novel, I am hearing Plato. I know his arguments against literature. And I'm always hearing his voice in my head, and I'm always trying to convince him by what I write of a novel otherwise. I'm always trying to convince him of the philosophical worth of novels. This really has a depressing effect on my sales. If I did not have to answer to Plato, I could write much better or flashier or best-selling novels, perhaps. Anyway, there he is, Plato. He's in my head. And, I'm terrifically interested in philosophy of mathematics, foundations of mathematics, and there is a view called Platonism there. That's the one place in which you hear the word Platonism. Are we in mathematics? Is one discovering objective truths, or are we making it up as we go along, or is it a kind of fiction? Are mathematicians a bit like us novelists, fictionalism? This is an issue that I've been very, very interested in. Gödel's incompleteness theorems, written a book about that. Gödel was a passionate Platonist, as many mathematicians are. Anyway, Plato's been there. But it's really been my involvement recently in the issues that bring us together as secular humanists that made me want to go back to Plato and to the ancient Greeks, because philosophy emerged in exactly the same period as the major religions that still exist emerged, roughly 800 to 200 BCE. It's an extraordinary fact. It was first pointed out by the existentialist philosopher, German philosopher Karl Jaspers, that during this period, basically all of the normative paradigms, normative systems, by which everybody on this globe, including us secularists, identify ourselves or work within, were forged during this period. One of them made progress. The rest have been pretty much as they were when they were first proposed back then. But that's extremely interesting to me. So, philosophy and Greek tragedy as well, and the Abrahamic religions, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Confucianism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, and probably some isms that I'm forgetting, but that are still extant, all were forged during that period. So Jaspers called it the axial age because these systems sort of radiate out like axials of a wheel into our own time. Well, what was going on there? And why did the ancient Greeks, respond so differently? Why did they respond in a secular way or in a mortal way? It was a deeply religious society. Why did they keep their gods out of it? And what was going on in so many portions of the globe that people were thinking in these big normative ways enough so that they've come into our own day? Some social scientists are looking at these questions, and some factors have been identified. All of the normative systems were framed in areas that had sort of large city-states, pretty organized. They had a military, they had slavery, they had coinage. David Graeber, who's a anarchist anthropologist, calls it the slavery military coinage complex. Some other psychologists of religion have pointed to the fact that all of these areas had high standards of living, had the highest standards of living and the highest caloric intake of every place on the globe. All of these areas that participated in the axial age, or what I call the normative explosion. So I think, and they were impersonal, right? A village life, everybody, you knew everybody. In fact, the problem there always was incest, because you were pretty much related to everybody. So you had to keep track of kin lines, so you didn't end up marrying your sister or your first cousin. But you go to Babylonia or to Ur or to Athens, and there's a sort of impersonality. I think what happened is these sort of existential questions emerged. The will to survive being taken care of, it didn't require 24/7 attention, every moment of the day, paying attention to will I survive. The question of, and do I matter, emerged, which is still a question that we all ask ourselves. Do I matter? What do I have to do? Do I have to do something to achieve mattering? So many, it doesn't take too much reflection to think that, look, so many people have come before us. They lived the way we live, that is, with full engagement with their lives. They loved, they hated, they longed, they won, they lost, they failed, they succeeded. And they're just gone. There's no name, there's just as if they never exist. I mean, why do we even bother to show up to our existence in the first place for all the difference that it makes? The reason I know that people were thinking this kind of thing is because the Greeks articulated it. It's there in Greek tragedy. It's there even in the Homeric epics, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I figure, so the Greeks articulate all this stuff, but that's the kind of thing that forces this kind of normative thinking, this large-scale thinking, I think, to emerge. Here's an amazing fact. Pythagoras, Confucius, the Buddha, and the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel were all contemporaries of one another. I mean, this is, this was a moment of big normative thinking. Across the way from the Greeks was a still obscure tribe, called themselves the Ivrim, for their word for over, because they were over on the other side of the Jordan River. And they formulated a view as to why it was that they mattered by promoting one of their tribal gods until he, eventually became the creator of the physical world without and the moral world within. And they mattered because they had been made in his image, and he had chosen them. And he wanted them to behave in a certain way, and if they did, all would be well. These two views of these two Mediterranean peoples, the Greeks and the Hebrews, have very much dominated Western civilization on this question of what do we have to do to matter. Why did the Greeks, it was a very religious society. Their society was drenched in religious rituals. But yet when it came to this existential question, what do we have to do in order to matter, they never turned to their gods. They definitely didn't want to take the route that the Hebrews were doing, that is, that we matter because we bask in the attention of God. That's the last thing that the ancient Greeks wanted, was the attention of their gods, right? Something terrible always happened. It's just go to a museum and look at the great works of art of Western civilization, the rape of Semele, the rape of Io, the rape of Ganymede, the great rape of this one, of that one, at the very least, a rape if you attracted too much attention from those Greek gods. They're horrible, those Greek gods. And that's interesting. Why did that happen? But anyway, so it was really that. It was these questions that unite us all here. Why the answer that is so dominated in Western civilization, that we matter because we're made in the image of God, and that, what can possibly ground our mattering and our caring for one another if that goes, that here, at that same time, a different approach to this question was offered and has been developed, has actually moved on, has made progress. Because these guys, these ancient Greeks, they thought that ancient Greeks mattered, right? And that their word for non-Greeks was barbarians, because to the Greek ear, all non-Greek languages sounded like blah, 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 or bar, 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 which is how you said blah, blah, blah in ancient Greece, right? So that Plato has an argument against enslaving who? Other Greeks, right? There is no notion that it might be wrong to enslave non-Greeks, that they might matter as well. This has been a long process that continues, right? This understanding of who it is that matters, and it's still in the process. We're still discovering how far we have to extend this mattering. Anyway, that's what got me back to the Greeks, and I wanted to understand why did they go about it in this way? Why did Plato go about it in this way? Why Plato? As I say, I don't love him either. I recognize his fascistic tendency. How could you not? But he pretty much created philosophy as it still exists. The man had an incredible nose for the philosophical question. Philosophy is subdivided into many subdivisions, many subgenres. For every area of inquiry, of human concern, there's pretty much a corresponding philosophy of that area, right? Philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of science, and then of the sub-sciences, philosophy of biology, of the social sciences, of physics, philosophy of economics, philosophy of history, philosophy of religion, philosophy of art, epistemology, philosophy, theory of knowledge, ethics, political philosophy, metaphysics. I'm forgetting things just like I've forgotten some of the major religions. But for everything that you can think of, there is that correspondence. And the amazing thing is that Plato kind of asked the first of these questions in these various areas. Well, not all of them, and it's dubious that he could really ask the questions of philosophy of science because there really wasn't science around in those days. But he had a kind of nose for this peculiar sort of question, many of which would eventually be answered by science. Not all of those questions could resist the growth of empirical knowledge, but a lot of them have. A lot of them haven't been absorbed into science, and I would argue can't be absorbed into science, which doesn't mean we haven't made progress with them. So that was one of the things so I wanted to understand the roots of this. Why did secular reason emerge in the Greek world? Why did they approach this question of mattering in the way that they did? And to see them in the context of the emergence of religion. And the other question was, this question of progress. Trying to make this argument that, and that here I know many of you will disagree with me, that philosophy has made progress. And I thought, what's a way of doing this? I mean, I can attack it, in an expository way, and I do talk about it in an expository way. But it would be interesting to employ the dialogue, which Plato employed for very deep reasons. Plato tells us that he wrote with great reluctance. He doesn't really believe in writing down philosophy. He tells us in the Phaedrus, you're a fool if you think the writings you leave behind you can actually do any work. It's like a statue that just stands there, and if you ask the statue questions, it just stands there. Well, a book too will just keep repeating the same things over and over again. You need a living dialogue. You need a living conversation. And he says in the 7th letter, if that is veridical, when I was in graduate school, we all thought it wasn't. Now many scholars do think it's authentic, the 7th letter, but in any case argue that it was written by somebody very, very close to Plato, and so we can infer much about Plato from it. But anyway, Plato says in the 7th letter, or is said to have said in the 7th letter, he's never committed his philosophy to writing. So that's interesting, right? But he did write. This man who much doubted that philosophy could be done through writing did write. He wrote a great deal. And he wrote really well, really fantastically well. I mean, a lot of it I have no patience for, but a lot of it is, quite amazing. And as a novelist, it's also interesting. I mean, when you read it as a philosopher, you're just looking for the arguments and what's wrong with them. And, there's much to analyze in terms of what's wrong with them. But if you read it in terms of drama, it's really extremely interesting because, his characters are well formed. They argue, they put forth their views in a way that also reflects their character. Certainly the character of Socrates that Plato creates for us, but Alcibiades and Critias and my favorite sophist Thrasymachus in the first book of the Republic, who argues that might makes right and is a real bully. He argues that way. And so there's a tremendous artfulness in this. And then, of course, when Plato lets loose with his lyricism, as he does in, say, the Phaedrus, a dialogue about erotic love, and Socrates' second speech, where he takes back everything he said in his first speech, which is lovely, right? Because that's also what philosophy is all about, always being open to criticizing your own points of view and revision. But when Socrates in that second speech, lets loose, he soars to the heights of lyricism. It's beautiful. In fact, Shelley has a translation of, that's actually of the Symposium, but he ought to have done the Phaedrus too. Anyway, so I thought it would be interesting in trying to make the case that philosophy has not gone away and that it is still, people are arguing it all the time, and they are addressing philosophical issues all the time, including some of our best scientists, when they argue for the obsolescence of philosophy, are often putting forth philosophical views. Sometimes well, often not. But just everybody, people were worrying about how to bring up their children, what kind of values to give them, whether they should be successful or happy or virtuous. There's a quaint idea. When we're arguing about all sorts of ethical questions and political questions, the limits of science or the lack of limits of science, that these are fundamentally philosophical questions. And so I thought, what would be really cool, but of course I couldn't possibly do it because it would be way too hard, would be to try to write dialogues, bringing Plato into our day, addressing some of our issues, rooting what I have Plato saying in the real Plato as often as I could, extracting passages from his dialogues so that I'm just not making him up whole cloth, but as you say, a better, more improved, more lovable Plato who I guess what I was really trying to do with this Plato was give him what I think is the best of the spirit of philosophy, which means insatiably curious, eager, avid for scientific knowledge, to take in all that the best science of our day can tell us, and trying to assimilate that science into a coherent framework, trying to reconcile it with other intuitions that we need in order to live maximally coherent lives, which is, I think, really what philosophy is trying to do, and why it is so important that any philosopher worth her salt keeps up with all of science, right, as much as is possible, but to maximize one's coherence and to bring the scientific image of the person together with other intuitions that we need in order to live rational and coherent lives. So he is insatiable when it comes to scientific knowledge. He gets himself, the first place I take him is the Googleplex, the headquarters of Google in Mountain View, California. They have authors come there to read. Authors at Google, I had been there for 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a work of fiction. And I came back, with this book, which was really interesting. And the first thing, he gets into a dialogue there with his media escort, who is a very, very practical woman who has no use for philosophy at all, and for a software engineer who also has no use for philosophy, two different kinds of no uses for philosophy. And he gets into a dialogue, and the software engineer tries to convince him that the kinds of questions that he had asked can be crowdsourced, that one could build a search engine. He calls it ethical answer search engine, EASE, so that you could answer all these questions with ease. Our technology will allow us to answer. And Plato, and I actually am able to lift out things that the man actually said, can knock that down, right? And the next place I take him to is the 92nd Street Y, the center. It doesn't mean the same thing here. It's in New York. It's in Manhattan. It's kind of the center of intellectual life, they like to think. And there he's on a panel of child experts on how to raise the exceptional child. A question. In fact, in a few weeks, I'm going to be in Mexico debating Amy Chua about is self-esteem, the tiger mother, right? Is self-esteem important in raising your child? I'll just read the invitation to the 92nd Street Y. Join us at the Y for what promises to be the highlight of the season. Zachary Burns, beloved columnist for the newspaper of record, will lead a discussion on how to raise an exceptional child. With Zach will be best-selling author Mitzi Munitz, author of Esteeming Your Child, How Even the Best-Intentioned Parents Violate, Mutilate, and Desecrate Their Children. Sophie Z, best-selling author of The Warrior Mother's Guide to Producing Off-the-Charts Children. And Plato, best-selling author of The Republic. And they argue it out there. I have him giving love advice, right, to what you guys call an agony aunt. We don't use that expression, but in the States. But I actually made up these questions that I knew Plato would have some answer to because of the symposium and the Phaedrus. Like, I'm a graduate student, jobs are very hard to get. My professor has offered to be a professor with benefits, no strings attached. Should I do it? I sent it to this advice columnist, a professional advice columnist who is my friend, and she answered the question first, and then she consulted the expert, Plato, as channeled through me. And again, I am quoting him. Everything is tied to the dialogues, right? It was interesting that Plato often gave more liberal advice than this professional advice columnist did. I put him on Fox News debating somebody I call, what's his name? Roy McCoy. The show is called The Real McCoy. Somewhat based on O'Reilly, although I couldn't quite fulfill my homework assignment, which was to watch O'Reilly. Just wasn't good for my health. So I got him through Colbert. So it's once removed, right? This is a time when Plato begins to despair of the limits of rational discourse. The last place I take him to is to a neuroscience lab. He volunteers to be part of an experiment, as I volunteered to be part of an experiment so I could write about it. Somebody who is doing research at Harvard, a guy named Joshua Buchholz, on felons, on people, convicts who are in high security prisons, and their limbic dopaminergic system, does it operate the way other people's normal, people who aren't locked up, let's say, in high maximum security institutes, does it operate differently? Plato and me we're both part of the control group, of course, right? But he gets into a conversation with the two neuroscientists as to whether or not the new cognitive neuroscience, the advances there, have eliminated certain concepts to which we seem wedded, like free will, personal agency, personal identity, accountability, moral responsibility, and these things. And by then, he's already taken on MOOC. Do you know MOOC? Massive online open course, right, on neuroscience. So he's totally up to date on the latest neuroscience, and again, can engage these guys or a guy and a woman on these questions that I think we're all very, very concerned with. So anyway, that was it. Go back to the past, try to understand why secular reason emerged as a way of trying to answer these questions of mattering. Still available to us now, and made a bit of progress, still in the process, and also as a way of showing that these questions are alive and can benefit from philosophical sophistication. Bring Plato into our day and see what he has to tell us, and that's the weird book. So thank you, and I'll take your questions.